Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm astonished by the value of your Jewish-Christian relations programs here, and it makes me aware that we have a lot to do in Austria about this. We don't have any comparable program at my university. I hope I can contribute to fostering this important topic. I also hear from colleagues that they love teaching here because students are curious, engaging, and not just steering towards career, but trying to develop their minds. Therefore, it's a great honor for me to be able to speak to you this afternoon. It might be the only occasion in our lives that our ways cross. So I'll try to give you some of what is most important in my life and to me as a scholar, because life is short. It will be a lot, but I hope it will keep together and the message will be one. First, I'll try to speak a little bit about Deuteronomy and difficult texts of violence. And then I'll try to talk about my experience in life as a person who tries to think about life and share this experience that brought me to Holocaust studies and to Jewish-Christian relations. First, let me just show you I fear the switch is not yet working. Let's try again. Here. This is Sistrans. It's a little village near Innsbruck in Austria, a wonderful place where I originate, where I come from, where I grew up. And this, just in the valley below that, there is Innsbruck, and that's the Jesuit church there, where we have a theological faculty at the State University. It's a wonderful environment of mountains, the Alps, in the heart of the Alps. And I'm showing these beautiful images. This is what we love to do in winter. I'm showing these images to say my life is very lucky. I'm blessed with a wonderful life, and that's a background to be able also to talk about very difficult issues. Let me start with the book of Deuteronomy in its major literary contexts. You're perfectly aware that Deuteronomy is the fifth book of Moses, the fifth book of the Pentateuch, so the fifth book in the biblical canon. And it's part of a large historiographical enterprise where biblical authors tell us the story from creation to, if we go through beyond the Torah, beyond the Pentateuch, through the books of Joshua, to the books of Kings, to the fall of Jerusalem and the demise of the kingdom of Judah. Within the Pentateuch, after Genesis, we have a long story of 4 books from Exodus to Deuteronomy that comprise the lifetime of Moses. And the first half of the book of Exodus, chapters 1 to 18, describe this move from Egypt to Sinai. At Mount Sinai, at the peninsula, God appears to the people and reveals his Torah, his laws, through the book of Leviticus. In the book of Numbers, we find the 40 years of the journey through the wilderness. Israel has to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years, an entire generation, because of their unwillingness to take the land into possession, their refusal to obey to the voice of God, and therefore this entire generation of Sinai dies in the desert, and on the last day of Moses' life, they find themselves in the land of Moab, in the plains of Moab, at the border towards the promised land. in the book of Deuteronomy, which is entirely staged in the plains of Moab, Moses delivers his farewell speech, his testimony to the people of Israel. And after that, he dies at Mount Nebo. And after his death, because he is not allowed by God to enter the promised land, the people take the land into possession under the leadership of Joshua. This is what the book of Joshua is about. The first half concerns the taking into possession of the land, and the second half, the distribution of the land. And then the rest of this long historiography through the books of Judges, Samuel, and Kings concern the life of the people of Israel in the promised land. You remember, after the kingdoms of Saul, David, and Solomon, the kingdoms are divided between the north, Samaria, and the south, Judah, Jerusalem as the capital. But both these kingdoms are in the end destroyed. First, the northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians, and this is told in 2 Kings 17. So historically, we are here finding ourselves around 720 BCE. And then the kingdom of Judah, with its capital Jerusalem, is destroyed by the Babylonians, which is described in 2 Kings 25 in the year 587 BCE. At the end of this long history, we find ourselves in total catastrophe. The kingdoms are destroyed, the capital is destroyed, the monarchy, the king is taken captive, his sons are slaughtered in front of his eyes, and the temple is destroyed. Even the temple, the house of God. So it's truly a catastrophic story that is told there. Within this major complex and these 9 books, Deuteronomy has a very special place because it's situated at the end of Moses' life, which is the end of the constitutional phase of the people of Israel as the people of God. And in his farewell speeches, Moses both looks back to the experience of the people since Egypt and the liberation, since the book of Exodus. Moses reflects on the importance of that experience for the people for the future. At the same time, Moses is a lawgiver. He teaches the laws of God from Mount Horeb, that is Sinai in Deuteronomy, to the people. And at the same time, he is also speaking as a prophet about the future, warning the people that if they obey to God's voice, they will have a blessed life in the land, in the promised land. But if they will not obey, they will lose the land. Their life will not be continued in the land. And both these prophecies are fulfilled, especially in chapters 4 and 29 to 30. Moses speaks about the far future of the people of Israel, explicitly warning of the possibility of the loss of the land and the dispersal among the nations, among the peoples. A dispersal in Greek, that is diaspora. This is where the word comes from. And precisely that happens in the 2 chapters that I mentioned earlier, 2 Kings 17 and 25. In 2 Kings 17, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom are deported to Mesopotamia, the so-called 10 lost tribes, as you will find them in the literature. And in 2 Kings 25, the people of Judah are deported to Babylon by the Babylonians, and some of them flee to Egypt. So the loss of the land, dispersal, the diaspora among the nations is complete according to the end of the Book of Kings. And this total catastrophe that we find at the end of this grand historiography is reflected upon intensely in the so-called great prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Going back to Deuteronomy, it also has a special role within this historiographical complex because Moses is speaking as a political rhetor, a speaker who is situated firmly in the present day. Today, Hayom in Hebrew is one of the key words or Leitworte in these discourses. And as we will see soon, this word has a very specific and complex function. And from this viewpoint of the present day, he's looking back to the past, learning from the past, and or teaching lessons from the past, and looking forward to the future as a prophet. Deuteronomy is, in that sense, or in two senses, a book at borders. At the border of the Promised Land, geographically symbolized by the river Jordan, and at the border of Moses' life, because he knows he is not allowed to enter the land. Therefore, Moses' farewell speeches are his testament. He cannot enter the land with the people, but he transmits his Torah for the people in written form so that the people of Israel can enter the land with Moses' legacy, with his Torah, which is the essential teaching for their lives in the land. This is, let's say, Deuteronomy's position within the major literary historiographical context. Now, one thing is literature. These books are texts, they are literature. At the same time, this literature has a place in history. And this is a topic we biblical scholars are grappling with all the time. It's very complicated, but at least some of the key dates are quite clear. And I shall focus on just a few of the key dates. The story of Moses is staged in the late 2nd millennium BCE, that is the late Bronze Age, but the period when these texts were written, in fact, is much later, somewhere around the middle of the 1st millennium BCE. And some of the key dates are precisely what we already have seen: the destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians around 720 BCE, the so-called reform of King Josiah, which is told in 2 Kings 22 to 23, the famous discovery of the book of the Torah in the temple in Jerusalem, which is strongly related to the Torah of Deuteronomy, which historically took place or is situated around 622 BCE, and the fall of the southern kingdom of Judah in 587 BCE, roughly. And then another important the key date is 539 BCE, when the Persian Empire grew strong, when King Cyrus of Persia took control over Babylon and allowed people, including the Judeans, to return to their home territories and reconstruct temples such as the Temple of Jerusalem. What I would like to highlight in this context is that the major context for the emergence of these texts, and in fact most texts of the Old Testament, is early empires which were very violent. Imperial violence is a major context for the emergence of our texts. This is a schematic map of the growth of the Neo-Assyrian Empire from the 9th to the 7th centuries BCE. So the dark green, let's say the nucleus, the kernel of this kingdom of Ashur was located in what is now northern Iraq, the Mosul region. It grew in the darker green sphere in the 9th century BCE, and its largest extension it reached in the 7th century BCE, in 671 BCE, when even entire Egypt was conquered. And the Neo-Assyrian Empire is really, as many ancient historians hold, the first real empire in the history of humanity, because they did not just conquer these territories, but they put in place a systematic administration. Similarly, a century later, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire was in decline and the Babylonians took over power, their territory was not as large, but still they used comparable methods to subdue surrounding little kingdoms in order to sustain a luxurious, enormous wealth in their central territory in Mesopotamia. So this kind of conquest was systematic. The entire system was based on the principle that an enormously wealthy center can only be sustained by massive extractions of taxes by coercion. And therefore, in order to achieve this goal, extreme military violence was used in regular royal campaigns, military campaigns, which at the same time were commanded by the gods, as the royal inscriptions claim. Now, in order to make this a little bit more concrete, we should look at the example of the city of Lachish, which is a wonderful place for us as biblical scholars and historians and archaeologists, because we have so much different evidence from this site. This city was conquered by the Assyrians around 700 BCE. It's located some 48 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem. And archaeologically, we still can see this ramp leading up to the Tell, which is a military siege ramp in order to carry war machines, destruction machines, up to destroy the city wall. We will see it in a minute. So I should say, in parentheses, that siege warfare was the regular method of warfare in the ancient world and up to even early modernity. And the method is simple. You encircle a city in order to starve it, to force the defenders to give in and surrender the city. And if they don't surrender, you try to assault and break through the defense lines and the wall. We even have the arrowheads of the Assyrians from that period. But what is most striking is that we have also texts and a huge relief, pictographical representation of this siege of Lachish around 700 BCE, now in the British Museum, originally in the royal palaces in Nineveh. So we can go briefly through these terrifying scenes. The Assyrians attack the city. The defenders on the city wall are throwing down burning torches and stones. The machine, a sort of tank, we would say today, is driven up this ramp in order to destroy the city wall. And at the same time, we can see in the same image already a later scene, namely civil population, women and children being led out of the city into deportation towards Mesopotamia. In the further development of the reliefs, we can see this forced migration, deportation of people very clearly here, women, children, men with their few goods. At the same time, men, that is warriors, are slaughtered by the most gruesome means. They are here impaled, here they are flayed. And this whole procession in the end arrives at the kings of Ashur's throne, who receives the glorious victory of his army. So this is a blunt visualization of what historically actually happened, brutal warfare in order to subdue small kingdoms. I should keep track of time. I'm only very briefly mentioning an important text, at least so you have heard of it, which is Esarhaddon's succession treatise, which is an incredible propaganda text written on large clay tablets. And this text is an example of political and, if you wish, textual violence. Military violence is one thing. There are also political and textual means to force people to subdue to an empire. This is an extreme example of this, where the king of Ashur forces all subjects of his empire to swear loyalty to himself and to his designated crown prince. And this loyalty oath is protected by countless curses. So all the gods of the Assyrian Empire are invoked as witnesses against those who take the oath. If you break the oath and commit any disloyalty against the king of the empire, all kinds of evil will befall you. This is the basic message, and this is important for the book of Deuteronomy, because in the book of Deuteronomy we find severe curses that most likely are influenced quite directly by this hated text. Let's skip the details of the archaeology. It's all fascinating, but we would need another hour for that. Let's move into a few key texts of the book of Deuteronomy. The first major central discourse of Moses starts in chapter 5. And there we read, Adonai Eloheinu karat imanu berit bechorev. Adonai our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Lo et avotenu karat Adonai et berit hazot ki itanu anachnu elefo hayom kulanu chayim. and I'm giving you a very literal translation. Not with our ancestors did Adonai make this covenant, but with us, we, those here today, all of us live. Now this cluster of so-called indexicals in the last line is extremely complex and intelligent in its political rhetorical force, because it brings to life the covenant of Mount Sinai, that is Horeb in Deuteronomy, not only for the new generation to which Moses is speaking in the land of Moab after 40 years, but to any community that reads this text again. So if we today read this text and read or hear the voice of Moses saying, not with our ancestors did Adonai make this covenant, but with us, all of us who are here today alive, we can, as a community, as a congregation, apply this message to our situation. In this sense, this is a homily, but also like a political constitutional discourse that can be applied to any community at any time. A very powerful way of transmitting the message through history. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons, in my view, why the Jewish people, why Judaism, in a cultural sense, has been able to keep its collective identity through more than 2 millennia. This should read Deuteronomy 6. No, this should read Deuteronomy 6, 4-5. I'm sorry, this is the famous Shema Yisrael. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, B'chol levavcha, V'b'chol nafshecha, V'b'chol me'odecha. Listen, O Israel, Adonai our God, literally Adonai one. There are several ways of translating this and interpreting this. We are not going into the details. And you will love Adonai our God with all your heart and all your life and all your intensity. You all know this text, and you know that Jesus quotes it when he is asked, what is the most important commandment? He quotes from Deuteronomy. He quotes the words of Moses from the start of this major discourse in Deuteronomy 6. This is just to say, this book and the Torah of Moses concerns the core of the teaching, not only of Judaism, but also of Christianity. This is the core of what our life is about as faithful Christians and Jews. And I'm just mentioning these two crucial texts to remind us that these are at the very center of our faith, of our tradition. I should here underline that the motif of the love of God, which seems so natural to Christians because it's a central motif in the Gospels, it originates in Deuteronomy. Nowhere else in the Pentateuch, from Genesis to Numbers, we find a theology of love with this explicit term. In Deuteronomy, it's very intense. And this is what Jesus quotes when he's asked about the central commandment. So we are at the heart of the tradition of Judaism and Christianity. At the same time, we find very disturbing and problematic texts in Deuteronomy. One of them in Deuteronomy 7, where Moses commands to destroy the Canaanite peoples. And it is a text where we may be shocked if we ask ourselves the question, is it possible that God commands genocide? Or that Moses commands genocide? I won't go deeply into that difficult question. I would like to look at another extremely disturbing text together with you. And this we find in Deuteronomy 28. I mentioned already that Deuteronomy 28 contains very graphic curses that partly are influenced by this terrible rhetorics of the Assyrians. But the Bible even goes beyond the Assyrians. Maybe nowhere else in the ancient world has been written such a terrible text. It's certainly one of the most terrible texts in the Hebrew Bible. It certainly is never read in any church. In synagogues it is read because the entire Torah is read. I will read it for you, but please be warned. If you don't want to hear it, please leave the room. It's really most gruesome. So the voice of Moses is warning the people of Israel of disobedience. If they are not obedient, they might face the assault of an enemy from the north. They shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted, so this is siege warfare, remember, come down throughout all your land, and they shall besiege you in all your towns throughout all your land, which Adonai your God has given you. And you shall eat the fruit of your womb, the flesh of your sons and daughters, whom Adonai your God has given you in the siege and in the distress with which your enemies shall distress you. The man who is the most tender and refined among you will begrudge food to his brother, to the wife he embraces, and to the last of the children whom he has left, so that he will not give to any of them any of the flesh of his children whom he is eating, because he has nothing else left in the siege and in the distress with which your enemy shall distress you in all your towns. The most tender and refined woman among you, who would not venture to set the sole of her foot on the ground, because she is so delicate and tender, will begrudge to the husband she embraces, to her son and to her daughter, her afterbirth that comes out from between her feet, and her children whom she bears, because lacking everything she will eat them secretly in the siege and in the distress with which your enemy shall distress you in your towns. So this is probably the most terrible way of saying the most terrible thing that one could even imagine: to suffer from starvation so much that people would even eat their own children. Now, there are several aspects to this terrible text. One is that I fear behind it there is real experience, historical experience. Because we know from many other examples through human history that starvation drives people mad. If you starve, if you really suffer from hunger, you cannot control your mind anymore. You get crazy and you do whatever you can to get something to eat. Another aspect is that it is also a literary motif that we find in many texts throughout human history. This traumatic fear of having to eat even one's own children. At the same time, of course, this is extreme rhetoric that tries to persuade listeners to act according to Torah. But I think today we also have to think about trauma theory in order to try and deal with difficult texts like these more deeply. I will return to this a little later. When did we start? When should I wrap up? Okay, thank you. Deuteronomy does not end with this terrible text. It ends with a call to life. Chapter 30 invites the people of Israel to make a choice based on the blessing and the curse that Moses presented in chapter 28. I have set before you blessing and curse, and I call heaven and earth as to witness against you. So choose life so that you may live and make long the days in the land that Adonai swore to you, and so on. So there is not a catastrophic end in Deuteronomy. There is a choice and a hope for life. But it's a very urgent call to choose life. Okay. Let me conclude for the moment what I tried to say about Deuteronomy as a political call to life for the people of Israel as a people of God. Let me turn to a decisive experience in my own life that transformed my own way of thinking about history and also the Bible. When I was 30 years old, I discovered that my father's father was a Gestapo official. And I had not known anything about it. It was totally new to me. So it was a shock. And it forced me to learn many things. I had to study the history of this grandfather, Fritz Markl, whose name I did not even know. I had to learn, and only 10 years later, I learned that he was shot in this prison in what is now Serbia in 1949, that he had been declared dead before that. I became aware not only of this history, but I also had to learn about the effect of trauma through generations. And an important part of that is repression. I had to learn why my father repressed this topic throughout his life. He wasn't able to engage with it because he had lost his own father as a child and grew up with the fear of talking about it. So I had to learn about Sigmund Freud, his trauma theory, and I tried to learn more about the sociological implications of mass trauma, collective trauma, as it was studied by Kai Erikson at Yale and Jeffrey Alexander, who talks about cultural trauma. Then strange things happened in my life. As I was teaching in Rome, in this international community at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, Steve Pisano, a Jesuit from California, standing here, is not alive anymore, told me that there are lists in the archive of the Biblicum, and I found these folders that don't look very exciting, but they contain more than 4,000 names of Jews that were hidden in monasteries in Rome during the Nazi occupation of Rome. And it took me many years to understand why it was so difficult to deal with these documents. Why were they not published? And why is it so difficult to engage with the Jewish community of Rome about these documents? And it took me 4 years of totally secret work with Yad Vashem and the Jewish community of Rome before we could publicly announce this find last year. obviously I could talk more about that. I learned about Augustin Bea, who was the rector of the Biblicum at the time, and then one of the main authors of Nostra Aetate, the Second Vatican Council, which transformed the relations between the Roman Catholic Church and Judaism. And then from Rome, I returned to Innsbruck, my home city, and I stumbled across another incredible story of a survivor, a Polish Jewish survivor, a young woman. Here she's seen as a teeny Leocadia Justman with her mother, Sophia, and her father, Jacob, who went through an ordeal in Poland and then came to Innsbruck. And an incredible story. They survived a year of prison. That is, her father was killed in Innsbruck, but she survived a year of prison in Innsbruck because she met the director of the prison, who together with 4 other police people helped her not to be deported. And in the end, this was the prison which is totally forgotten in Innsbruck. This is the director of the prison. This is an SS man who gave them his personal home address to come there when they escaped from prison. They did escape, they did survive. All the details of the story are left out. The last weeks of the war they spent with this priest, Leopold Wintersteller, and Maria Gruber. And after the war, Leocadia wrote down her story in this house in Innsbruck, 500 typewritten pages in Polish, that only now, after 8 decades, returned to us from Florida because her son scanned them for us. It's an incredible story of survival and a project of peace that she wrote down immediately after the war. This is our survivor at the grave of her father in Innsbruck and at her wedding in Innsbruck in 1946. We are doing a major project with a publication of her memories in German in January, and the last moment of this story was last night in New York, where I met for the first time her 2 grandsons, wonderful young Jewish fellows who are successful business people today. How do these topics that I tried to share with you belong together? What I learned in, let's say, the more than past decade of my life is that mass violence and war leave marks of collective trauma upon societies through many generations. And repression of memory is part of how we'll deal with such trauma everywhere, through history and in all societies. And it is highly significant, I think, how societies can deal with such trauma, both victims and perpetrators and their descendants. What we need in engaging with trauma, such as imperial violence in biblical times and the world wars of the 20th centuries and ongoing wars, is representation, that is, acknowledgement of the pain, of the suffering that happened, to overcome mere repression, because mere repression, which to some part is necessary, but repression has the disadvantage that the trauma comes back in uncontrolled ways. But representation is not enough. It needs to be framed by a positive outlook to life, hope, belief in life, engagement for peace, trust in God. We find these aspects both in the biblical texts, in the book of Deuteronomy, that represents the trauma in the curses, but frames it in a positive outlook towards life in chapter 30, choose life, so that you may live. And in our Holocaust survivors story, Leocadia Justman, who tells her story, but the motif of trust in life and trust in God is what helped her survive, as she tells in her story, and she writes down her memories as a peace project for the future. So this is basically what I would like to share with you. Based on the decisive moment of my discovery, which was very painful, that my own grandfather was a Gestapo official and obviously tortured people. I had to learn that trauma is a transgenerational force that affects my society, my own family, but basically all societies. And it is a ubiquitous phenomenon, and for all societies, it is extremely important how we address it. The Bible gives us examples of how to address gruesome realities in a framework of hope to overcome this terrible experience. And we have more recent examples that are, to my mind, extremely valuable. This is how I think that Deuteronomy, trauma, and politics and beyond relate. This is what I tried to share with you. Thank you very much for your kind attention.